Hey everyone, welcome to the February 8th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are taking a look back at last week's racing from around the country, focusing primarily at the start of this podcast on the 3 Kentucky Derby prep races that took place last weekend. All 3 of these offered 10 Kentucky Derby qualifying points to the winner of the race, though those 10 points were not handed out in one of these situations. That would be the case in the Robert B. Lewis, which took place at Santa Anita, the Derby prep that I think had a lot of people talking on Sunday evening. We'll talk about that one a little bit. They also ran the Holy Bull at Gulfstream and the Grade 3 Withers at Aqueduct. We'll knock those out at the top of the show, but there was other stakes racing to talk about from around the country this past weekend, including a bunch of graded stakes at Santa Anita on Saturday and Sunday. We had a few graded stakes for the 3-year-old sprinting in addition to the Holy Bull at Gulfstream on Saturday. Also, they ran the Toboggan, which produced an upset at Aqueduct. Happy Medium going down to defeat there. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show, and then we'll close out the podcast by briefly visiting Tampa Bay Downs to talk about their 2 graded stakes there from Saturday that were run on the turf course. But Craig, as I was saying at the top of the show, the race that had so many people talking on Sunday evening was that performance by Messier in the Robert B. Lewis. What did you make of it? Because this was clearly a breakout effort from him.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very fast effort. Obviously, he got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a bit reminiscent of the 130 we saw from Life is Good. These are figures that will win most of the Triple Crown races if they can be reproduced. I would guess maybe there's some questions about that, but Messier's a horse who's shown a lot of talent all along. He seems to struggle a little over the low south surface, but his other efforts have been really good, and this one was on another level. That you just aren't going to see 127s very often. You are going to have to talk about the track and take that into consideration. It did seem like it appeared to favor speed pretty strongly all weekend. We have it coded in the bright red color, and it's kind of hard to argue when you look back through the charts of all the dirt races. So I think it does come with a little bit of question mark, but the horse is obviously very talented and just took it to a whole different level here.
Yeah, the race was very reminiscent of Life is Good's coming out performance, and I believe it was the San Felipe last year when he won by a wide margin over Medina Spirit, and I think earned a TimeformUS speed figure at or approaching 130. So Messier, a similar situation here, getting a 127 for this Robert B. Lewis. We've seen some big speed figures posted on the Kentucky Derby Trail over the past several years. You've posted lists of them in the past. I can't remember them all. It does seem like often the horses that are topping that list come out of the Bob Baffert stable. He just seems to get a lot of the best 3-year-olds, the ones with dirt route pedigrees. Owners like to send them to Bob Baffert to try to get the most out of them proceeding towards the Kentucky Derby. A lot of trainers aren't able to consistently get the results that he does, but it seems like he always lands up with the best horses in his barn. As I was saying, this one did not accrue any Kentucky Derby qualifying points. Bob Baffert obviously has been widely reported his horse is not eligible to gain Derby qualifying points on the Derby Trail, with him being banned from the next 2 Kentucky Derbies by Churchill Downs. So we'll see what the owners decide to do with Messier and all of these other Bob Baffert trained runners that are pointing towards the Kentucky Derby. I know that Corniche, another Bob Baffert runner that a lot of people were expecting to see on this Triple Crown Trail, I don't even think he's working right now. So clearly there's a lot of uncertainty in the Bob Baffert stable about what the representation will be in some top races later in the year. But putting all of that aside for a moment, like you were saying, Messier was really impressive. I do think the track had something to do with the performance with those speed favoring surfaces on both Saturday and Sunday. Not something that's that atypical at Santa Anita. Seems like that's often been the case recently over that main track, especially in the 2-turn races. It seems more pronounced that it's a little difficult to make up ground. But whether the performance was exaggerated or not, Messier ran a really fast race, and it seems like the Son of Empire maker has just taken a huge step forward, because we had never seen this kind of effort out of him in his first 4 starts. Even though he had looked good in his prior races at Santa Anita, this was a huge step forward, so we'll see if he can duplicate it down the line.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I just glanced through the Timeform US charts for the entire weekend, including Friday, and basically every dirt race was won either wire to wire or by a horse who sat second just off the pace early on. So I think it was obviously a pretty strong bias and something you're going to have to consider going forward. And I will definitely be monitoring the horses that ran on these days.
The two other preps from this past weekend did not come up quite as fast. Let's talk about the Grade 3 Holy Bull from Gulfstream. This one had some pretty big names coming into it, with last year's Remsen winner Mo Donegal running, the third place finisher from the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Giant Game making his 3-year-old debut in here. But there were some disappointing performances in behind, as White Abarrio was able to get back into the winner's circle. His performance here certainly flatters the form of the Kentucky Jockey Club that he was coming out of. That race won at Churchill Downs at the end of last year by Smile Happy. But White Abarrio, Craig, got a pretty favorable pace situation up towards the front end, but he really finished strongly in this race.
Yeah, he did. He finished fine in this race, obviously. I wasn't impressed with the race. I think it took a major turn at the start when Simplification pretty much blew the brake. And I thought that one actually ran pretty darn well in defeat to be able to get second. I'm still not sure what to make of how far he wants to go, but White Abarrio was fine. But for me, I think it was just the fact that a lot of others didn't really show up. I know there's some questions about the speed figure. But I have it as just a 106. I guess the buyer team gave it a what would be a much higher figure if you did the conversion. But when I made the speed figures for this day, it was pretty cut and dried that this wasn't going to be a fast race. I will say it was the only route race on the day, and I assume they had some horses rated a little bit differently than I did coming in. But as far as I was concerned, it's a pretty easy figure to make, and just a race that for me was below par.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. There was a lot of raised eyebrows, I think, on social media when you put the figure out for this race, because I think they had already seen that the buyer speed figure came back at 97 for White Abarrio, which typically would translate to a number in the high 1-teens on the TimeformUS scale. He just got a 106 for this race, knocked down a little bit from the 108 final time speed figure because, as I was saying, the pace was pretty moderate up towards the front end. And I agree, Craig. I think that White Abarrio got a great trip to win this race. Simplification, not so much. He typically had been a speed horse in the past, and the fact that he broke so slowly, it really did put him out of position in the early going, though I did think that Javier Castellano, and especially the horse, actually reacted pretty well to that unfamiliar situation. It didn't seem like Simplification got rank at all. He actually adapted pretty well to coming from off the pace, so I think that just shows that maybe he's a more versatile horse than the connections had given him credit for up until that point. The horse that I do want to discuss coming out of this race, Craig, is Mo Donegal, because it's kind of a weird effort for him. He was in behind horses early, maybe a little bit farther back than you wanted to be in this race, kind of given the way it played out. But he kind of ran in spots. It looked like he was spinning his wheels on the turn, but seemed like he found his gear in the late stretch. It was just with that very short stretch going the mile and 16th distance, he ran out of ground.
Yeah, it did. It was a weird race. He never looked like he was going to be a winner to me. And I mean, I do think it's kind of important to note he still was beaten 4.5 lengths. For me, he just seems like a horse who can't put it all together. I know he had won his first couple, but he hadn't run particularly fast doing it. Always looked a little just weird. Of course, he was used as a battering ram by Red Ortiz in his last start, so maybe that had something to do with it. But yeah, I'm just not impressed by this group. The other horse I wanted to mention in here was Giant Game, who came out of a nice finish in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, a third. But we have to say at this point, that race is looking pretty sketchy. Didn't get the best TimeformUS speed figure that day for that race, only a 113. And the horses to run back out of it are kind of backing up that was not a very strong Juvenile.
Yeah, I was going to make that same point about Giant Game. He just did not run at all in this race, and I think every horse that's run back out of that Breeders' Cup Juvenile has failed to win in their subsequent starts. Some of them have run comparable speed figures, but nobody's really taken a step forward, so that is something that's worth bearing in mind as we move forward and more horses come back to run out of that race. Just to wrap up the discussion on the speed figure, Craig, obviously with that big disparity, I know it can be tough at this time of year to kind of gauge which horses are improving, which aren't, which races have come up fast just because everybody took a big step forward. And I know when you don't have any other route races to compare it to on a card like Gulfstream on Saturday, and that's one of the difficulties with Gulfstream when they're running on 3 surfaces now, you don't get a large sample size on any surface, especially with some races going 2 turns and some races going 1. You don't have that body of dirt races to compare them to anymore. But it can be difficult, I know, because it's possible that all of these horses just took a big step forward, but I know it's hard to build that into the speed figure and have confidence in it.
Right. We do project plenty of improvement for 3-year-olds from race to race based on how long they are in between races and things like weight changes, stuff like that. But, it is tough. Like I said, I wouldn't be shocked if it came out that I rated this race too low. But looking through the chart and looking at the also-rans, I'm pretty happy with it. And I guess we'll see going forward. My guess is the Bayer team rated this race right along with the sprint races, which I understand because I did use a higher variant for the 2-turn race. But one thing to keep in mind at Gulfstream, the run-up is pretty short in these sprint races. It can be around the 15-foot range. They list it longer, but it's not always that long. Whereas the route race, I think for this one, they listed as 50 or 60 feet, and it's actually closer to 80. So when you have that short run into the first turn, they're usually going pretty quick, and I'm just really hesitant to rate them together. So we'll see. It's certainly one that we'll track going forward to make sure. And if I think, after a few races I got it wrong, I'm usually not hesitant to change them. We don't change a lot of figures at TimeformUS unless we think it's just a pretty blatant error. So we'll see. For now, I'm going to stick that I think this was not the strongest prep.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to take a critical look at the Bayer speed figure for this race, I think the things that might raise some eyebrows are the fact that a few horses did improve their top numbers by upwards of 15 points. I mean, it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around the improvement for the 4th place finisher Galt, who was coming out of a very slow maiden win, and I think Bayer has him improving 22 points, the 6th place finisher improving 15 points, even the winner of this race running a new top by 16 points. So, I mean, you have to kind of take that leap of faith that everybody took a big step forward, which is possible, and I know that having looked at the Bayer speed figures a lot, it's their method to kind of rate all the dirt races together and not break them out by distance so much. Craig, I know that you kind of tend to go into the latter camp where you're more willing to break them out by 2-turn versus 1-turn. There can be big differences on the dirt at times. So just kind of getting into the weeds about speed figure making a little bit. But in a race like this, when you have such horses that are improving quickly and not a large body of work to go off of, it's understandable how 2 different methods can lead to 2 different kind of numbers.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about one in the next race as well at Aqueduct, where we also had one-turn race. And just the last point on this is kind of what you mentioned. The big thing I go on, when horses look impressive as 3-year-olds and late season 2-year-olds and make big jumps, I'm not leery of giving big figures at all. But when the entire field does, including horses that you watch the race and to the eye, they just didn't run very well, it's hard to give them 15 and 20 point jumps. And just based on my experience, it almost never works out when you rate those races too highly.
Moving on to the other Derby prep from this past week at Aqueduct, the Grade 3 Withers going that demanding 1.125 around that winterized Aqueduct surface. Early voting went off as the heavy favorite of this one, coming off a maiden victory for Chad Brown in his career debut, and took a big step forward in his second career start to win this race decisively. Now, this one, Craig, another race that some people were a little bit confused about the difference between the Bayer speed figure and your number, but I think this situation, it just comes down to how much TimeformUS builds pace and pace upgrades or downgrades into their final speed figures.
Yeah, this was one where the difference wasn't that much at all. Usually just a rough guide is we're about 20 points higher than Bayer. In this case, we were maybe 22 or something. I forget what the exact numbers were. But we also gave him a 7-point boost on the overall TimeformUS speed figure because of how fast he went early. And that's actually throttled back a little bit because he had such a big lead. We tend to only give you credit for about a length. Anything above that, you think the horse is kind of running off. We just try not to give just too much credit for horses that won't reproduce that number if they're challenged. But in this case, it was quite the interesting race. It was run over a track, if memory serves, where the rail was still not the place you wanted to be. But by this point in the card, even the jockeys who had been the slowest to realize it realized you couldn't be near the rail, and it looked like there was a moat about 4 paths wide between the rail and where the horses were running. And Jose Ortiz just absolutely gunned him out of the gate, opened up the lead, and just kept going. He was clearly the best horse in here. I do think he kind of sapped some of the main contenders who weren't like Courvoisier, who had run some nice races, but was in chase mode and faster pace than he's ever seen before. Horses like Cook Creek, who were just up too close, and that kind of allowed some horses who were lagging at the back to kind of stumble into second and third, but I wasn't very impressed with those. I was impressed with early voting. To do this in just his second career start, run a 109 TimeformUS speed figure, is pretty impressive. That doesn't mean I think he's a real Derby contender. Obviously, he's going to have to keep improving. There's still a big gap between him and what we've seen from some other 3-year-olds. So nice effort in the second start, and we'll be curious to see him going forward. I'll certainly be watching.
Yeah, I remember taking note of that same thing on Sunday at Aqueduct. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when we get to some of the racing from this past weekend at Aqueduct. I think after we go back to Santa Anita, Craig, and talk about some of the racing there from this past weekend, a few of the other graded stakes events. Also for the 3-year-olds on Sunday at Santa Anita was the Grade 3 Las Virgenes. This was won by the Bob Baffert-trained Adair Manor, and very similar situation what we saw with Messier later on in the Robert B. Lewis. This filly just absolutely dominated this affair, won by open lengths.
Yeah, she had been super impressive in her first 2-turn race when she broke her maiden at Santa Anita, had jumped her speed figure 20 points up to a 112, and she backed it up in this spot with a 119, not quite the Messier level, but pretty darn close, and another big effort from her. It should be noted with this race and that one that they're really small fields. There were only 4 horses in this one, and again, I do think you have to consider the racetrack it was run over, because it probably helped boost that speed figure a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit hard to buy into this idea that both of these horses took such a big step forward and suddenly have cemented themselves as the Oaks and Derby favorites, or I guess they would if they could run in those races, and these actually gave them some points towards those races. That's not the case with, I believe, Adair Manor can't receive Oaks points either. I don't think it's just for the Kentucky Derby. People can correct me with that if I'm wrong. Yeah, I mean, she ran a big race here. Like you said, there was really nobody behind her. There was one other horse, Queen of Thorns, was coming off a debut victory, and I guess she ran okay to be second, but she had to work pretty hard to beat some inferior runners in behind. So I don't think that Adair Manor was beating the best 3-year-old fillies out there. She certainly ran a very fast number and did it well. I guess based on this performance, she should be considered the best 3-year-old filly out there. I want to see her do it against some real horses, and I want to see her do it over a fairer racing surface. But she obviously is one that's pretty talented. Move on to some graded stakes racing from Saturday at Santa Anita, and another dirt route that they ran. This one for the older males was the San Pasquale, and it was won by a horse that we've gotten pretty familiar with at this point, Express Train, one that's been knocking at the door at the Grade 1 level for quite some time, but seems like he's kind of found his niche against the current group of handicap horses that are stabled in Southern California, as he collected his second straight graded stakes victory here, and I would say he took a step forward in doing it.
Yeah, that's a horse who pretty much always runs his race, other than he had one clunker in the Pacific Classic. But other than that, he seems to always show up. He always runs those 120-ish type TimeformUS speed figures. He got a 126 here, and I want to give some credit to Victor Espinoza. He kind of hustled him out of the gate. I was surprised to see him up so close early, but I think he was aware of the track even at this point on the card Saturday, which was pretty late on the card Saturday, but he took full advantage, and he was just much the best horse in here. I mean, there's some decent, solid horses behind him. Law Professor kind of showed that last race on dirt wasn't a fluke, and maybe he's a horse who will be better on dirt, as he got a 122 in second. 8 Rings is always solid. He always sets the pace, just doesn't seem to hang around at the finish of these races. But he's a solid enough handicap horse, ran his usual low 120 speed figure. So good effort from Express Train. Not going to get too super excited about it. And that 126, I would say, even kind of points to the bias a little bit because it's right up there on the higher end where he usually runs probably about 4, 5, 6 points lower on his better days.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, about Express Train's performance. Maybe it was a little bit exaggerated by the way the track was playing, because I agree with you. Victor Espinoza did a really good job kind of taking advantage of that, because this horse never breaks that sharply. He's a little flat-footed away from the starting gate sometimes, and it looked like he was going to get caught in behind horses, but Victor kind of felt that he was a little bit aggressive and let him run up into that position, and I think that's something that Victor Espinoza does well. He doesn't really get in his horse's way. He likes to let them do what they naturally want to do, and that was the case with Express Train here. So he did take that speed figure step forward. We'll see if he's able to duplicate that in some subsequent starts. I'd imagine he's the kind of horse that they'd be looking to point towards the Santa Anita Handicap, which I believe should be coming up soon. 1.25 miles has kind of been his bugaboo in the past. He hasn't quite been able to conquer that distance, so we'll see if he can do it now that he's in good form right now. But going this 1.125 miles this past Saturday, he was just a little bit better than the horses in behind him, though I do agree that Law Professor ran pretty well to be second. Those Bob Baffert trainees, they just could not quite recreate the magic of some of their younger stablemates. They were the disappointment from the Baffert stable here, as they didn't allow Bob to sweep all of the graded stakes on the dirt from this past weekend. Bob did win 3 out of the 4, though, as he collected a graded stakes victory going that sprint distance earlier on Saturday with Merneath in the Santa Monica. I believe it was the second straight year that she was winning this race, and she did it pretty impressively this time over Cece, who could be being crowned a champion later this week.
Yeah, I thought it was a good effort, and you're right. It was the second time she's won this race. She only had to go back 2 races to see it because she had a nearly year-long layoff before she came back in that small stakes last time out on January 2nd. Lost to Edgeway, but honestly, I thought the bettors got this one wrong. It looked like a race where she was probably going to have a pretty easy lead, which she did. The horse shown closest to her on the pace projector was her stablemate, another Bob Baffert trained Calypso. You knew those two weren't going to duel with each other, and CC was just kind of in a tough spot, and it was a weird race flow as well. When you look at our figures, she actually went pretty quick early. She ran a 123 pace figure, but then the race just came to a crawl as she was allowed to continue to lead. CC did make up some ground by that portion, but at that point the race was over. There was just no way she was going to be able to run her down. Merneath went from a 107 half mile to a 124 final time figure, and you're just never going to be able to catch a top horse when they're able to do that. It was one of those race shapes that looks so weird that I actually went and timed it and checked that half mile time just to make sure, but it was spot on. So I came within a couple hundredths of the time on the replay, so it was good to go. It was just a race where Edwin Maldonado got the lead and just backed everybody up, slowed it down, and there was no catching her. She wound up with a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, knocked way down because of that slow half mile, but the 124 final time figure was pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was a pretty soft trip for Merneath, but she did really run well here. A big improvement second off the layoff for her after kind of coming back with a bit of a disappointing effort last month at Santa Anita when she was just a second best to Edgeway. But I would say she got back to her Santa Monica form from 2021 and perhaps even bettered it here in beating Cece, who typically can overcome some pace situations. She just was not quite as sharp as Merneath in this race. I would say that perhaps the way the track was playing did carry Merneath along a little bit, in conjunction with the fact that she was able to set that slow pace. As you mentioned, Craig, they did really slow down in the middle portion of the race, so I do think that really helped Merneath produce the strong finish that she did, but she really was coming home pretty strongly at the end of this race. That improvement in the TimeformUS pace figures from a 107 to 118 up to 124 is something you don't often see, especially at Santa Anita. Horses typically show a little bit more speed and then kind of peter out. She really flew home at the end of this race. This was one where the Beyer speed figure team had it much faster, and we don't often do like this comparison comparison between TimeformUS speed figures and buyer numbers on this show, and I don't think we're going to start. It's just we kind of opened the door on this podcast. I know there were some questions about it, so in this situation, I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, but I think buyer did have this as the fastest race of the entire weekend, getting a 108. But Craig, that just mostly comes down to the fact that for the TimeformUS speed figures, we really do give a downgrade for the final TimeformUS speed figure in sprint races like this, when horses are able to get away with such soft paces on the front end, and that was certainly the case with Merneef.
Yeah, my point about this race was, for me, it's more giving Cece an excuse, because I thought she ran really well given the circumstances, the way the track was playing, the way the pace was. So I'm not going to knock her too hard, and I expect her to run better next time out.
One other graded stakes event that was contested last Saturday at Santa Anita was the Grade 3 Thunder Road early in the day on the turf. And Count Again, a horse that I was chasing quite a bit last year and just kept on disappointing me. He came back off a layoff here and got a little bit of class relief, and I think it really worked out for him because he was able to produce that potent late kick that we had grown accustomed to seeing from him about a year ago.
Yeah, I didn't have too much interest in this race. I was surprised. I thought he should have been the favorite in this field. It just said he was getting some class relief, and it wasn't the strongest field you're going to see even for a grade 3, but mostly because I've never been the biggest Subconscious fan. He went off 3-5 in here. We're talking a lot of weird speed figure stuff today, so I'll bring up that he's a horse I got a lot of grief for back when he actually, I think, ran about the same final time as... who was that older California? Yeah, Mo Forza, that's him. And we gave vastly different speed figures, but it had to do with pace, and it's definitely panned out. As Subconscious, he always kind of shows up, runs his race in the mid-teens, but I just don't think he's anything special, and I'm not sure why the bettors went so overboard on him in this spot. Maybe he just looked like he was going to be clear. Our pace projector had it in blue and had him on the front end, but I've just never been a biggest fan as him, and I thought, as you said, that Count Again was much the classier horse.
Yeah, I thought Count Again ran well to win. It's not like they were blazing a pace up front, and he actually ran really well to produce that final kick to get up here. But I've been burned by this horse quite a bit in the past, so I'm not necessarily looking to bet him next time out in a Grade 1 race. We'll see what they decide to do with him, but I think he probably has a little bit of improvement to find, even against some of the top turf horses in California right now. So we'll see what they decide to do with Count Again for his second start off the layoff.
Right, I don't think I mentioned he ran a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, which even for a grade 3 is maybe right at the bottom end of par for a race like this.
Let's move back over to Gulfstream Park. As I was saying at the top of the show, they ran some other stakes races for the 3-year-olds this past weekend, including a couple of graded stakes sprinting on the dirt. The one for the males was the Swale, going 7 furlongs earlier in the day on Saturday, or rather, I think it was 6.5 furlongs. And My Prankster, a Todd Pletcher trained runner who was so impressive in his career debut last year at Saratoga, didn't quite pan out after that, was a little disappointing in a few races, but seems like he's cycling back up to that debut speed figure.
Yeah, I thought he ran pretty well. It was 7 furlongs. I had to look. I thought maybe they changed it. But yeah, he ran well. He didn't break great from the rail, but it didn't seem to matter. He was able to grind down the leader, Dean's Delivers, in the stretch, who's been a pretty good sprinter. I know we've talked about him on the Pacecast before, but My Prankster is just kind of grinding along. He had that big debut at 111, then he kind of regressed, but he just keeps working his way back up, and this was a slight career top at a 112. So good effort from him. I'm not really sure what the plans are. I don't know if he's a horse. I would think he's not a horse that Todd Pletcher thinks wants to go long, or he probably would have tried it by now, but there's nothing wrong with being a top 3-year-old sprinter. He'll have plenty opportunities to show his stuff.
Yeah, I thought the runner-up in here, Dean Delivers, was really game to be second. He's now had a string of second-place finishes, I think 3 in a row since winning his career debut, but he's run well in all of those races. I think we talked about that January 8th allowance race that Dean Delivers comes out of, and we saw a couple horses come out of that allowance race to run really well this past week at Gulfstream. We're going to talk about another horse from that race in a little bit, but Dean Delivers improved to run the highest TimeformUS speed figure here of a 113, and I thought he gave My Prankster all that he could handle. For a horse it showed so much speed in his debut, Craig, my prankster, he's kind of been a little bit more flat-footed out of the gate in some recent starts. Luis Saez had to really get after him on the backstretch to kind of regain contact with the leaders, and he made that big looping move. But like so many of these top Pletcher-trained runners at Gulfstream, he just kept finding more through the stretch.
Yeah, the streak he's on is something. I haven't looked. I assume we if we don't have him in red in TimeformUS for Gulfstream, we probably will soon because he's just obviously winning everything.
The other graded stakes sprinting for the 3-year-olds on Saturday at Gulfstream was the Grade 3 Forward Gal for the fillies. This one also 7 furlongs, won in a bit of an upset by the Brad Cox-trained Girl with a Dream, who was winning her 3rd in a row here. And Craig, I think pace had a lot to do with this one because she just got clear of this field early, and her main rival, Radio Days, just had a little bit too much ground to make up.
Yeah, she did. I mean, it's not like she stole the lead, but it was a pretty moderate pace. We have the half mile coated in blue. She was able to establish the lead and kind of slow it down, not to the extent Merneith did earlier, but it was a weird shape where it slowed a little, then sped back up. And as you say, Radio Days just had too much to do. Both of them took nice jumps. Girl with a Dream had previously been running in the low 90s, jumped up to a 106 TimeformUS speed figure. Radio Days, 104. Which she had run a 105 in her debut. So she ran her race, just think the flow kind of went against her. And it's always going to be tough if you're going to be a sprinter and you drop as far back as she does, particularly behind a pace that was at best moderate. So she's going to need to do a little bit better out of the gate and get going a little sooner if she wants to be a top sprinter. Radio Days, that is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I wonder if she is a true sprinter. I know Shug McGahee sometimes is not so keen on stretching these horses out immediately. He does it more gradually. She is bred to go longer. She's by Gun Runner. There's some stamina on the bottom side. So I feel like maybe this is just a stepping stone for Radio Days to eventually get to a 2-turn race. We'll see what Shug decides to do with her. But I thought she ran pretty well here to be second. I wasn't that disappointed, even though she lost as the odds-on favorite. And Girl with a Dream, she's solid enough. I don't think that she's going to prove to be among the best 3-year-old fillies out there. But as you were saying, she got a little bit of a breather mid-race, and I think just got the right kind of trip to win on this day. Another race from Saturday that caught some people's attention was a maiden race a little bit earlier in the card, as first-time starter Nitrous Channel led home a parade of first-time starters who all ran some pretty fast speed figures, and this one was a son of Nyquist going out for George Weaver, and he was certainly ready to deliver a pretty stellar performance in his career debut.
He was. The top Pletcher trained Palm Island drew inside and took a lot of money to be bet down to 6-5. But Nitrous also took a lot of money, as he must have been showing something in the mornings. He was bet down from a 6-1 morning line to 5-2, and the Todd Pletcher horse Palm Island had some trouble, ducked in the gap early, got shuffled back, and Nitrous Channel just ran a big race. He was able to set a pace in a race that was pretty moderate. We have a couple of the fractions in blue, and it just kept getting faster throughout. His final time figure was actually a 113 as he was drawing away from the field. It's knocked down a little to a 109, but that's a pretty darn good debut. A higher figure than we gave the Holy Bull later on the card. So promising horse. I'll let you talk about the breeding. He is by Nyquist, so obviously he's got some ability or some chance to go long, but I liked what I saw from him.
Yeah, I thought this was really impressive. I know sometimes these races can be tough from a speed figure standpoint when so many of the top finishers are first-time starters. It can be a little tough to be sure about how fast they went, but like you were saying, there were plenty of races to compare it to other sprint races on this card, so it seems legitimate that all of these first-time starters ran really fast numbers, and visually, Nitrous Channel was really impressive. He's a son of Nyquist, his chestnut, burly kind of horse. He looks like a bull out there, like a pure sprinting type to me. Though his pedigree might say he could go longer. I mean, he is by a Kentucky Derby winner, and his dam sire, Fleet Alex, won the Belmont Stakes. There's not a whole lot of dam side pedigree to highlight in terms of runners that the dam has produced, but this one certainly seems like he's pretty good, and despite not having a lot of pedigree, he sold for $625,000 off a 2-year-old sales work last year, so clearly he had shown some speed at the auction, so I don't think it's a big surprise that this one was very fast on Saturday. It's funny, Craig, the George Weaver barn is a stable that I think for a long time has been known at winning at a nice ROI, steady 20% win rate. They had been going through a real slump for the past few months. I mean, I think going back to the middle of last fall, his horses were winning at a much lower rate than usual. But, this game can be cyclical, and it seems like he's had kind of a burst of success recently. He's had a few winners at Aqueduct. He's had a bunch of winners at Gulfstream, including this horse this past weekend that came forth with a really big race. So nice to see George Weaver getting some good horses to deliver in his barn. Seems like he's got a pretty exciting one here in Nitrous Channel. But I also thought that the runner-up, Stay Restless, ran pretty well for Todd Pletcher. I mean, he was the least heralded of the two Todd Pletcher runners, and he stayed on pretty well for second. It seems like one that could want to go longer, though, being a Son of Empire maker.
Yeah, I was going to point him out when you were done. I thought he ran fine. The comment says he was bottled up. And when I watched the replay, I don't think that's an understatement. I do think he got held up a little bit when the winner was able to make his run and put some distance between them. But he was finishing off the race really well. Got a 104 TimeformUS speed figure running in second. So he's got some promise. And I'd be surprised if we see him run 6 furlongs again anytime soon.
One more race that I wanted to bring up from this past week at Gulfstream was a Friday allowance race for the 3-year-olds, and just notable because I think a lot of people had their eyes on this race based on the presence of a couple of Todd Pletcher runners that were coming off debut wins. American Icon, a very impressive son of gun runner, who won first time out, and also Ironworks, a My Racehorse owned runner who was an impressive debut winner. But Craig, they were both upset here at odds of 4-5 and 2-1 as the Kelly Breen trained In Due Time just took a big step forward first time on the stretch out and seems like a horse that really relished the route distance here.
Yeah, he did, and it's not like he had run that much slower than the two Todd Pletcher horses. They have run 101 and 98. In Due Time had run a 95, won a well-beaten third in that Dean's List and Dean Delivers race, so I don't think the jump up to a 106 is anything that was too unforeseeable when you're talking about 3-year-olds. He clearly liked that one-turn mile and the extra distance. So yeah, 106, nice speed figure, and I would expect better from him next time even. He's certainly moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that race that he was coming out of, because we've now talked about a couple horses coming out of that allowance race that was won by Dean's List. Dean's List was a Todd Pletcher trained runner who I think is now 2 for 2 in his career. And both Dean Delivers, who was second, and In Due Time improved their Timeform US speed figures by 10 points or more coming out of that race. So it seems like that could be a key race. We'll see what happens with the winner when he comes back. I don't know where he'll be running next. But In Due Time, Craig, I think he's just a horse that did really relish the added ground. Son of Not This Time, and he just had the kind of finishing speed that those two Todd Pletcher trainees really couldn't match. He made a bold move around the far turn to take over and just widened under pretty much an easy hand ride in the late stages by Paco Lopez. So he's one that I imagine we'll see in Stakes Company next time out. Let's move on to Aqueduct as we just visit a couple more venues on this podcast before we wrap things up. The big race there on Saturday obviously was the Withers, but they also earlier in the day ran the Grade 3 Toboggan for the older horses going 7 furlongs. Not a particularly competitive field on paper, as it looked like this was a foregone conclusion for Happy Medium. That's not the way it played out on the racetrack, Craig, as Happy Medium just did not show up for whatever reason. I think we can probably pinpoint some of the reasons, but drafted that big gray 8-year-old son that's or a son of Field Commission who's competed in Dubai and now the United States, finally able to get a victory in the U.S. as he collects this Grade 3 win.
Yeah, this is a race for me. It's kind of hard to take it too seriously because I just think at this point in time the track was so strongly tilted to the outside that it was almost like whoever made the widest, most sweeping move was going to win, and that's exactly what Drafted did. He ran fine, but his Timeform US speed figure is nothing special. He's going to get a 117 for the effort. So solid effort, but the story for me is Happy Medium. He just didn't show up. He had run a 125, destroying an allowance field back in December at Aqueduct, and for whatever reason, he was up on the pace. He was too wide, and the pace was pretty darn quick in this race, and I just think those factors together, just he didn't really have much chance. I saw some speculation that people thought maybe he had bled, but his owner, Samantha Siegel of JMS Stable, came out and said he was scoped. He scoped clean, so that had nothing to do with it. And for whatever reason he had an off day. I do think the track and the ride had something to do with it personally.
Yeah, I'm going to differ with that a little bit. I mean, the pace was not that quick as far as I could tell. I mean, it was a pretty even pace the entire way. Low 120s pace figures early on that ended up with a 117. It just seemed like it was more of a race flow situation, whereas you were saying you didn't want to be anywhere near the rail. It's not just a dead rail path. It was really the first three paths on the dirt course. You didn't even want to be anywhere close to the inside. Probably in the forward path would be safe, or further out than that. And I think this early in the day, the riders were not totally aware of that yet, and Manny Franco on Happy Medium just kept him in the two path the entire way, and it just seemed like a race where the Drafted was the only one that was on the right part of the surface, and he just ran by the entire field on the far turn. Like, I mean, he was in the slipstream, everybody else was just like mired in quicksand down towards the inside. And Drafted showed up here. He's a horse that I was a little bit frustrated by early in his career, or early this year when he came back from Dubai, because he kept getting slow paces to run behind. He had some trips on occasion. There was an allowance race last year at Belmont that he really should have won, but he got caught in traffic. I mean, he's a horse that had a lot of excuses piled up, but he just hadn't been getting to the winner's circle. And I even kind of felt here, I picked him second in this race, but I felt like he just wasn't going to get the right pace set up anyway. Ultimately, it didn't matter because of the trip that he got over this racetrack. He was just on the right part of the track, but nice to see this horse get a victory for a trainer like David Duggan, who doesn't get that many horses, but does a good job with the ones that he's gotten. So nice to see some connections that not a lot of people are familiar with get a graded stakes victory. And Happy Medium, I mean, I guess he didn't show up. I do think that the track bias had a lot to do with the performance. I'll be interested to see what happens with him next time, if there's some sort of excuse, if he needs time off after this. I guess if he comes back in relatively short rest, maybe it's a good sign. But I still think Happy Medium's a talented horse, and I'd like to give him one more chance.
Yeah, definitely not giving up on him. And you were right about the pace. I actually had the chart up from his previous win where he had run faster early in the high 120s. So yeah, low 120s. The pace shouldn't have had much to do with it.
One more race from Saturday at Aqueduct that I think we should mention was an allowance race a little bit later in the day, actually the race right before the Withers, and that was won by same connections as the Withers winner, early voting, with Southern District here for Chad Brown, Klarovich Stables, Manny Franco aboard this one. This horse took a big step forward on the turn back in distance to a mile. All of his other dirt route efforts had come around two turns, and seemed like getting into this one-turn race just allowed him to produce this explosive late kick that we had not seen from him before.
Yeah, this was impressive. He ran a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. I think that was the highest we saw at Aqueduct all week. If memory serves, you really liked this horse on the forecast, and man, he made it easy. He looked like a winner pretty much from the middle of the backstretch home. It looked like nobody was ever going to beat him. It's another one where I do think you have to consider the track. He did get the right trip. Some others in here didn't, but the way he won, I'm not sure it would have mattered, because he blew some others away in here. His main competition was Three Jokers. I mean, that one had a little bit of trouble early, but he got a nice wide trip too on this track and was just absolutely no match. So 119 for him, maybe a little bit bias aided, but I still think it was a nice effort.
Yeah, I mean, if you have any doubts about the way the track was playing, just go back and watch this race. I mean, the horses that were towards the inside or towards the front end and towards the inside just completely fell apart, even though the pace wasn't that fast. It was a pretty even pace the entire way, but, I mean, if you had inside position or forward inside position, you were doomed in this spot. And Manny Franco kept Southern District in the right spot, about 4 to 5 wide off the speed, and he was able to make that sweeping move to the front end. I mean, he's kind of a weird horse that Chad Brown got completely wrong. You can't often say that about Chad Brown because he's so astute with placing his horses, but I mean, he had pegged this horse a turf router from early on, kept kind of stubbornly, kept trying him on the turf, even though he's a son of Union Rags, and it turns out he's a pretty good dirt horse, and probably a pretty good one-turn dirt horse, because this was by far the best effort that he had ever put forth in his career. So I think he's one that might have a bit of a future now that they know what to do with him. Let's Let's talk about one more race from Aqueduct quickly before we move on to our final venue, Tampa Bay Downs, Craig. And that was a race from Sunday, the Jimmy Winkfield for the 3-year-olds going 7 furlongs. And you had talked a little bit earlier about how much the track was changing at Aqueduct on that Sunday card. I think this race was kind of run in the midst of that change happening, where you could still rally outside. It didn't seem like you needed to be down inside. It also didn't seem like inside paths were that hindered early in the day, or by the time this race was run. But regardless of all of that, I thought the winner of this race, Morello, was pretty impressive, took a step forward, and I thought beat a decent horse in Life is Great.
Yeah, he did. He got a 108 TimeformUS speed figure, a big jump over his 84 in his debut. This is one before I was ever with TimeformUS when I did speed figures for my own company, pacefigures.com. I would always warn people the biggest jumps you will see are these lately raced horses that win their maiden race in races with just crazy slow paces. You can often just ignore the speed figure, assume they're going to improve quite a bit, and he was one of these horses. The race he came out of, he had actually been off the pace. The early pace figure was in the 60s. He improved it to a 93 final time figure, so it was obvious he probably had more in the tank. It was no big surprise. I mean, he went off 7-5 favorite in here, but just something to point out, because sometimes the bettors will miss that or overlook a more fancied runner, but we didn't really have any of those in here, and he won easily. As you said, it was a much more fair track, I believe, by the time this race rolled around. So I think that 108 is pretty legit and a good effort from Morello.
Yeah, I like the point that you make about his debut. The TimeformUS speed figures, they are a multi-factor number where they take pace and final time into account. But, I mean, you can't just have one number that completely summarizes or completely encapsulates an entire performance. And you make a really good point about how everybody was just held down in that debut race. And you do sometimes see that with inexperienced horses. They can be a little bit tentatively ridden in the early portion of the races. And they just came home so fast in that race. And that's never going to be a high number on the TimeformUS scale. But these horses, they can often improve when they get into a different kind of situation in their second career starts, and that was certainly the case with Morello. Don't know how far he's ultimately going to want to go. Son of Classic Empire, I think we're still learning a little bit about him as a sire, but clearly took a nice step forward going the 7 furlong distance. I would imagine they could take a shot in a race like the Gotham, maybe get some Derby points. We'll see how tough that race comes up, or if they want to run him back that quickly, but I thought this was a good step forward in his second career start.
Yeah, and you mentioned key races earlier. Morello's race is one where the runner-up has already come back to win a maiden special weight at Aqueduct, Inevitable Connection. So maybe one to look for some of the other also-rans when they return.
Let's wrap things up from this past weekend at Tampa Bay Downs, where they ran a couple of graded stakes, both on the turf. The one for males was the Grade 3 Tampa Bay, going 1 mile and a 16th, and Greg, we had talked about Sherrill Spite and his return to turf when he won an allowance race last time at Tampa. We both thought that he had run pretty well, even though the speed figure didn't come back that fast. But boy, did he take another step forward here for Roger Radfield, producing a really nice turn of foot through the stretch to get up to win over Get Smokin'.
Yeah, I'm kind of kicking myself over this one because I didn't bet him, and the speed figure came back pretty good. It came back a 119, and I mean, that was pretty competitive in this field. Get Smokin', who I believe was one of the horses betting here, had run 120s, but he was coming off of a pretty long layoff. I know our guest from a couple weeks ago, Barry Spears, had put on Twitter that he really liked this horse, and I was still too dumb to be swayed, but He backed it up with another big performance, even a better performance in here. Got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. So I think we're going to see a lot out of this horse this year in these graded stakes. Not sure if he wants to go much farther than what we saw here, but he's certainly moving in the right direction as he's run career best 2 times in a row now.
Yeah, I know we had talked about him when he won that allowance race last time. He was a horse that was so highly regarded early in his career with those first 2 victories being so impressive. I think there was even some Kentucky Derby buzz about him at that time. I think they toyed with the idea of running him in that race during the pandemic back in 2020. Clearly, he's had some hiccups along the way since then, and they tried him on dirt a few times. It really does seem, though, like he is a turf/synthetic horse, and now that they're focusing on those surfaces, it seems like he's really coming to fruition. We'll see how good he ultimately turns out to be. I did think that this was a really impressive turn of foot that he displayed through the stretch in a race where there really was not that much closing going on from the back of the pack. Nobody else was making up much ground through the stretch except Cheryl Spite, the winner of this race. So I thought this was good effort and a really nice ride by Emma Jane Wilson to kind of split horses, a tight seam in the stretch, and get this horse into the clear to get up at the wire. Get Smoke into his second. I thought he also ran well, but the winner, clearly the best horse on the day.
Yeah, you make a good point. When you look at the finishers behind him, they were first, third, fourth, and fifth early. So he was the only one doing any running. And when you watch the replay of the race, it sticks out visually. He's the only one really moving at the end. So impressive turn of foot. He was definitely finishing off the race. He had only a 107 pace figure at the 3/4 mark and finished off with a 120 TimeformUS late final time figure. So big finish from him.
Roger Atfield was not quite able to pull off the double of the graded stakes wins at Tampa on Saturday as his heavily favored Lady Spite Spear went down to defeat a little bit earlier in the Endeavor Stakes. And can't say that she had much excuse, Craig, as she got a pretty good stalking trip here. The Chad Brown train, Bleecker Street, just unleashed a huge kick in the stretch to get her at the wire. I mean, this horse didn't look like she was going to get up coming to the quarter pole, but once Hector Diaz got her into the clear, she just rammed by the leaders with ease.
Yeah, that was impressive visually. A nice finish. She's now, I believe, 4 for 4 in her career. Improved her speed figure out every single time out, and not small jumps. She had a small jump the first time, but her third start when she won that allowance at Tampa, she went from an 88 to a 104, and this time she jumped all the way up to a 113. So it seems like Chad Brown has taken his time with her, putting her in the right spots, but so far she just keeps answering every call, and I wouldn't be surprised if she improved again next time out based on that finish.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't have pegged any of the horses that Chad Brown decided to run at the Monmouth at the Meadowlands meet last year to ultimately become graded stakes winners, because it seems like Chad Brown sends a lot of the lower-ranked horses in his stables to that circuit and that track especially. But as you said, she's just taken huge steps forward in her last 3 races. Did so in that allowance victory and then here in this graded stakes. And I guess we'll see how good she ultimately turns out to be. But she's clearly been a pleasant surprise for these connections. And Hector Diaz, I believe this was his first graded stakes victory, and he's been on this filly for her entire career, gave her an excellent ride at this race. So nice to see a rider like that get rewarded with a big win. And we'll see what the ceiling ultimately turns out to be for Bleecker Street down the line. Well, that's all the racing to cover from this past weekend, Craig. And as these Derby preps come at us, we start to have this 3-year-old picture take a bit more shape. We'll have some more coming in the future. I think we've got Tampa Bay Downs coming up this week and a couple weeks away from the Risen Star, where horses like Smile Happy and Zandon, some of the top horses on the Derby Trail, will be participating. So a lot to look forward to. Still a lot to be sorted out, but we'll be looking forward to that. And we'll also be doing some handicapping later this week on the TimeformUS Forecast. I've got a guest slated to come on, one that we've had on before that I know some people enjoy hearing from, so look forward to that a little bit later in the week. Everybody, remember you can always listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Forecast on Friday.